Makes about as much sense as anything, said Freze, shrugging. It's not uncommon for a tamer or other variations of the class to have skills or passives that increase some attribute or other of the beasts that they train and bond. Are there a lot of tamers or tamer-like classes? Xander found the idea of a class more focused around directing animals and providing them improvements interesting, as the few classes he'd had any combat experience with, namely his current companions and Thrypus, were much more focused on dealing damage in a much more direct manner. Yes and no, Freze said, confusing Xander somewhat. Yes and no? He echoed back. Well, there's a significant gap of tamers in the middle range of power. You see tamers who have access only to maybe local animals who may not be very powerful, and thus struggle to break into the middle reaches of power as they can't use their weaker animals or don't want to risk them, as is the case for those that get attached to their bonded animals to obtain more powerful animals, thus relegating them to smaller, lower-paying contracts, which also makes it very hard for them to afford anything from a merchant like we saw back there. 100 gold, even 50 gold, is a lot of money for most people, Xander. We can't all custom create magical items for people to sell, after all. So it takes a lot longer to accrue that kind of money, especially if you have living costs and the need to feed multiple animals. Speaking of which, what are you planning on feeding her? Well, I'd kind of just figured I'd let her go hunt on our downtime if we're in a good area for it. Beyond that, I guess I'll just have to use some of that easy money. I've got to buy meat. I bet she'd like to get some hunting in, Xander said, scratching Freya behind an ear. He could feel her delight at the idea of getting to go on a hunt again. Just no taking farmers' animals, he instructed the cat, fearful that she'd end up with a contract on her just like the bear Thrypus had originally been hunting when they'd met. I suppose that will do well enough while we're out of town like this. Once we reach Anlet, though, you're either going to have to stable her at a special establishment that can handle exotic animals, or handle getting the meat from a farmer or butcher yourself and feed her. And even then, you might have some inns turn you away if you want to keep her with other customers' horses. Makes sense that there would be special places for special animals in the bigger cities if there are taming-based classes. So you said that there were few tamers in the middle because the lower levels of taming can be really rough to break out of. What about at higher levels of power? Ah, those are the tamers that either got lucky, either by birth or location, and those that managed to make it through the slog of breaking out of the low levels. Some people are born into enough money that if they need to acquire a few good animals to start their career as a tamer, then their family can just buy them. Others are lucky to live in an area that had a natural abundance of stronger creatures, like those wolf spiders I told you about, remember that? Unfortunately. Well, if you happen to live in a place like Krepash, where there are creatures like that just running about, you'd certainly have an easier time getting yourself some high-tier bonded animals. Even at low levels, a tamer with a good selection of animals can take on a wide variety of contracts. Of course, in a fight with another skill user, especially against someone higher leveled than them, a low-level tamer is going to suffer. They might have lots of animals, but any high-tiered skill user is going to be able to handle an animal, and the tamer's not going to be able to provide them much improvement beyond baseline if they're low level. So either the skill user kills all the tamer's animals, or simply dodge the animals and go straight for the tamer to end the fight. A lot of people go against conventional wisdom and seek out ways to make sure that the classes they can get, or class amalgamations, that's when your classes combine, you know about that, right? Are as taming-centric as possible. What they really should have gone for is a secondary class that would have filled in some of their gaps, because once a tamer with no other skill sets loses their animals or encounters something their beasts can't overcome, they're done for. Of course, since it's so common to work in teams, if you come across a full tamer, they're likely working with a team to fill in those gaps instead. Xander nodded. I see. That all makes sense in my head. I might feel differently if some dude sets 3 low-tier bears on me, though. There is a certain strength to be found in numbers, Freze agreed. But you're selling yourself short if you don't think you couldn't handle a couple of bears with your skills and weapons. I guess you're right. I'm still looking at the world through the lens of someone who had 0 levels. None of this was a thing in my world, People were on a more equal footing in that regard. We came up with plenty of other ways to kill things, though. So odd to think of a world without status sheets, classes, or levels, said Frozé thoughtfully. Right? How do they get anything done? Graphis chimed into the conversation. In really roundabout ways involving lots of machines, mostly, Xander answered, not really wanting to try and do a deep dive into the complexities of things like power generation, energy grids, gas engines, or other modern infrastructure. Sounds tedious, Graphis stated. I think, compared to this world, it would be very tedious for you, Xander agreed. Unless you wanted to end up in jail or go to war, there wouldn't be much for you to fight. Unless you wanted to get into a career of professional fighting, but that's really only with bare hands. I think I'll stick with here, thank you very much, was Graphis's reply. Xander kept his reply, that he'd like to be able to go home to his tedious world and see his wife to himself. Freya, feeling the spike of emotion he'd had, turned her head to look at him. Xander offered her a smile and a neck scratch for her concern. The group traveled much the same way the rest of the day. Camp was a simple affair that night. The weather was nice, and since Freya wanted to sleep close to him, Xander opted to simply use his bivy sack with his sleeping bag, which Freya quickly curled around. It was uncomfortably warm being surrounded by a giant cat while also being in a sleeping bag. But once Xander unzipped it and managed to stick a leg out, he fell asleep quickly beside the dozing panther. The next day was even more uneventful than the last. There were no other interesting travelers on the road, and those that did pass them kept their animals a fair distance from the intimidating cat that was among them. Such a beast also marked them as almost certainly members of the Mercenaries Guild, and therefore not to be trifled with. The days passed like this. Some of the nights spent at an inn, where Xander had to beg the usage of the stables from concerned innkeepers, other nights spent out on the road. Freya would often hunt on those nights, and the mercs would wake up in the morning to find the cat cleaning herself and the remains of a deer or other animal on the outskirts of the camp. It had been rather unsettling how stealthily the cat had managed to sneak away, kill an animal, and consume it so close to them without waking anyone. They had not been taking watches, as this area was considered to be quite safe, the highway leading to the capital being well maintained in that aspect. The last leg of their journey took them through a stretch where they encountered no villages for 2 days. Apparently, according to Atrax, the land was not good for farming, and so there was little desire to settle in the area as it had no other unique resources. After those last 2 boring days, they were all happy to see the buildings of Anlet rising in the distance. As they drew closer over the course of the next hour, Xander was able to see that the city straddled a river, and boats and barges lazily drifted to and from the city following the current. Situated as it was, Xander could see why it was a large town. Being on the intersection of a major land trade route as well as on a river must make it a veritable hub of trade. "Welcome to Anlet," said Atrax grandly, opening his arms wide. "One of the largest cities in the kingdom and known as the place you can get anything from anywhere." "Is there really that much trade that goes through the city?" Xander asked. "Oh yes, the place is in just the right spot and, more importantly, inhabited by just the right people. Between the fact that it's on the cross of a river and the King's Road, and the fact that many of the noble houses have holdings and estates in the area, there is the capacity and the desire for all kinds of exotic goods. The menagerie we passed will likely offload a good portion of its inventory here when it eventually arrives. See there?" Atrax pointed to a distant outcropping of buildings, which even from here Xander could tell were lavish. "That vineyard is one of the Vitrax family estates." Noticing Xander's lack of a reaction to the name, he clarified further. "They're an old family of nobles. Been around forever. Lots of money." "Oh," said Xander. "So lots of people like that own house or manors or whatever around here?" "Yes, essentially." Atrax was slightly disappointed that Xander had had such little reaction to learning that there were lavish noble houses around. "More importantly," interjected Graphis, "watch who you talk to and how you talk to them. You don't want to get some young, rich, noble scion's coattails tied in a knot. They've got a bad habit of challenging people to duels, especially when they're drunk. Not that I don't think you'd win, Xander, but sometimes winning a duel like that can lead to even more trouble than just letting them take first blood and leaving it at that. Having someone who can leverage that kind of money and influence pissed with you is a special kind of headache. We usually stick to the less fancy areas specifically to avoid that kind of thing. At least then you only have to deal with the nobles who are obviously slumming it, but think they're sneaky enough that no one can pick them out. In case you were wondering, they're usually very easy to pick out. I'll keep that in mind. I like to think I'm not too abrasive, so hopefully I won't offend anyone too badly. What the plan once we get into this town anyway? Well, it's flexible, Atrax explained. Obviously, we have to find a place to stay and somewhere that can accommodate Freya, as it's considered rude and also dangerous to leave a bonded animal completely unattended. While things should be fine as long as she is with you, if you need to go somewhere that she can't, then she'll need to be at a stable for exotic animals. So ideally, we'll be looking for an inn that has that capacity. After that, we check the guild for any good contracts. Interesting kill or capture contracts, exploration, of course, bodyguard duty, that kind of thing. Once the good contracts dry up, we'll move on again. That's pretty much how we've been operating this whole time. Seems like a good enough plan to me. Flexibility is good. Have you three ever done a bodyguard contract? Xander asked. A few. Most of them were pretty cushy, commented Frise. Except for that one with the assassins, Graphis pointed out. Yeah, that one sucked, but we came out on top just fine, said Frise. You're just mad you took a crossbow bolt to the shoulder. Damn right I am. Is that kind of thing common? Xander sounded concerned. Hey, not really. Half the time it's some right family who wants to make sure no one gets too close to some precious son or daughter as they are out and around town. Occasionally there is a concern about actual harassment or attacks and assassination attempts, but generally it's rare that that information is known. Most of the time they're just playing it safe, and since they've got the money, then they'd rather spend it on a set of guards here and there than risk an abduction or assassination, Graphis explained. He was surprisingly unconcerned about the potential dangers of a contract type that had gotten him shot. I see. And we're the kind of team that an employer would want for a task like that? I see. And we're the kind of team that an employer would want for a task like that? More or less. We're decently well-rounded. I've got the position of frontliner and shield bearer, so I can provide cover for the person we're guarding if needed. Atrax has area denial covered, and Frise can keep enemies pinned so that they can't get close or follow. And now that we have you and your ability to reshape things, that provides even more options for cover and escape. The only way we could be more desirable is if we managed to get our hands on a healer. Are healers not common in the guild? Not really. Most people who end up with the ability to heal are a priest of some variety or other, so they often end up in the church. That's not to say that a priest can't join the guild. It's just not very common. There are other classes that end up with healing skills. Often those who depend on beasts or summoned creatures at least end up with a way to heal their companions, and there are healers who are not necessarily affiliated with any one religion. But healing is a skill that's always in demand, so there's not much pressure for one to join the guild in the first place when they could just set up shop and let injured people come to them. So when one does join the guild, they tend to get sniped and bundled into a team quickly. Oh, I see. Makes sense that healers don't have as much of a need to be a mercenary to make money. Kinda sucks for us, though, Xander lamented. That it does, Graphis agreed. If we manage to make enough of a name for ourselves doing contracts, then we might be able to get one of our own one day. It may not seem like it, but that bone giant is a great point to have on our list of achievements, even if it was a little on the small side for such a beast. So it's not normal for a group to encounter things like that? It's normal enough, but there are plenty of groups who would have deemed the money not worth the risk, retreated, and let another higher-leveled team take on the giant. They still would have received a partial payment for the work they did do, after all. That thing could have seriously injured one of us with a good hit, especially you three, since you don't have any shield skills. Without a healer on your side, that can be a big risk, and going down from 4 to 3 fighters can all but finish a fight. Not only has that person been taken out of the fight, unless you're willing to just leave them there to die, assuming they're not outright killed, then another team member is going to have to get them out of immediate harm. Cohesion gets lost, your damage output goes way down, and whatever you're fighting has an easier time focusing on a target when there are fewer skills hitting it. I didn't think of it like that. You're right about the importance of team cohesion and placement. If that thing had been chasing me around instead of trying to hit you, Graphus, then it would have been damn near impossible to get a good hit in with one of my grenades. And we were able to outmaneuver it mostly because of Fraze's abilities, pointed out Graphus. Take any one of us out of the fight, let alone two, and everything starts to go to shit. Got it. Well, you guys just don't let that happen, obviously. Problem solved, Xander said, at a loss for anything to really say about the reality of combat as a mercenary. Graphus laughed. Not planning to, but then again, no one ever plans to. The conversation turned to lighter topics as they traveled into town. Atrax had heard good things about an inn across the river, simply named Roberts, so they made their way towards that part of town. Taking in the city around them, Xander was awed at the mix of medieval-feeling architecture with modern amenities made possible by magic. Street lamps were placed at regular intervals, topped with stone globes that glowed a soft yellow. Cranes, much smaller than they had any right to be, were pulling large crates from barges docked alongside the river. Xander assumed that there must some kind of magic either reinforcing the cranes or somehow making the crates lighter. After all, if he could make something heavier with rune, why not magic to make things lighter? Xander even noticed a few runes carved on what looked like a manhole cover. Though he was uncertain of their purpose, he was quickly beginning to lump these things into a new category which he dubbed industrial magic. They passed people of all varieties and economic status. Xander saw rich and poor humans and dwarves, though there was certainly some stratification to where each preferred to gather. He even thought he saw an elf at one point, if the long, pointed ears were anything to go by. There were even otter folk in the crowd here and there that Xander noticed. Tall, lanky beings who seemed as if they had bark for skin. Barrel-chested, furred people with long, swishing tails. He'd have to ask about both when he could have a more private discussion with his group, away from people who might think him rude or ignorant. He tried not to stare too hard at any one person to avoid giving offense, but it was hard with some of the more outlandish and ridiculous-seeming outfits he saw some of the richer peoples wearing. Roberts ended up being just off the main road, a few streets down from the arching bridge that crossed over the river. The proprietor seemed a professional enough man, and the operation of the inn seemed smooth from what they could gather looking in from outside. Xander opted to wait with Freya and the horses. Fraze's stag had been released once more as they entered the city. Xander wondered if it was the same stag each time or a different one. He hadn't thought to try and remember the number of antlers and compare against the previous time Fraze had summoned a stag. He supposed he could just ask her instead. The owner of the inn confirmed to Atrax that there was a small section of the stable that was capable of housing animals of the more exotic variety, and that there was space for 4. The cost had been significantly more than what he'd paid to stay at Talon's, 5 silvers to the one it had cost him there, though that had been explained away by Atrax as Xander not only having gotten an extremely good deal from Briggs, as well as the fact that lodging just generally cost more in larger cities, at least if you didn't want to risk waking up to bugs crawling over you. There was also an additional 3 silver surcharge for Xander that covered Freya's handling and food for her. He expected that he might be able to feed her himself for a cheaper price, but the time and effort it would save him in sourcing the meat, buying it, then feeding her, made the price worth it to him. He could afford to stay there well enough with his remaining funds, and he was sure he could gather more coin by finding a smith to sell his labor to if they did not take on a contract soon. Having paid for their rooms, Atrax and Graphus stabled their horses before they headed to the guild. Xander opted to bring Freya with them. He'd grown fond of having the cat around already, and hated the idea of forcing her to stay in an enclosed space when he didn't have to. Plus, the cat needed more exposure to crowds. He could tell that the looks she drew from curious passers-by still made her anxious, and he wanted to make sure she was able to overcome that fear. He walked beside her, occasionally letting her know that everything was all right. He felt her anxiety lessen somewhat by the time they made it to the Mercenaries Guild. The guild building in Anlet was a significantly more extravagant affair. The three-story building was made with white marble, and several large statues of warriors in various poses served as columns supporting a balcony on the third floor. The building was a hive of activity, with a constant stream of people entering and exiting it as they went about their business. "Wow," said Xander, awed at the grandeur of the building. "I hear it's the nicest guild hall outside of the one in the capital," said Frise, craning her neck to look up at the edge of the balcony. "They look like they're sure to have plenty of contracts," Atrax said. "Nobles always need work done around these parts." So the 4 mercenaries and 1 Lauravian panther made their way inside. Freya was fortunate that the doors were similarly large and grandiose to fit the rest of the building, and the ceiling was high and vaulted. She had little trouble following Xander into the building, beyond the stares she received from anyone who looked their way. The inside of the building was filled with the roaring murmur of many people conducting business at once. A long, carved wooden counter bisected the length of the room, and many attendants were helping people at it, or going around the room pinning new contracts up and taking old or completed contracts down. Atrax and Graphis got to work immediately, perusing through the multitude of contracts posted on the walls, discussing the pros and cons of this contract or that. Xander, not feeling like he knew enough yet about the process, opted to watch the comings and goings of so many people. Frise stood with him and Freya instead of searching the postings like Atrax and Graphis. "How come you're not looking through the contracts too?" Xander asked. "How come you're not looking through the contracts too?" Xander asked. "Meh, a job's a job. I'm not quite as picky about them as Atrax or Graphis is, so I let them hunt out the best ones for me." She gave a small chuckle. "It's worked so far." "Fair enough," Xander said, going back to people watching. There were so many types of mercenaries. He saw robes and staves, crossbows, daggers, and leather armor, warriors in full suits of plate mail with large shields. It seemed like the gamut of archetypes was available in this space. A few minutes into watching people go about their business, Xander was startled by a polite clearing of a throat near him. Excuse me, I was wondering—" The girl, who couldn't have been more than 17 or 18, paused for a moment, gathering her courage. "Could I pet your cat?" Xander had not expected that. People's reactions to Freya so far had ranged from apprehension to apathy. No one yet had expressed any desire to actually interact with her, let alone pet her. Xander turned to Freya and asked, "What do you think, Freya? Want some pets from her?" Freya, ever needy for attention, stretched before flopping on the floor and rolling onto her back, exposing her chin for the girl to rub. She tentatively reached out to touch Freya's fur before settling into a slightly firmer scratch. "She's so soft," the girl murmured. "Very," Xander agreed. "So, what brings you to the guild hall? I promise I don't mean to come across as rude, but I don't see many people around your age here." The girl bristled slightly. "I'm 19, thank you very much, so I'm absolutely allowed to be here." Xander held his hands up in mock surrender. Whoa, I didn't mean to upset you, I swear. I was just curious. I'm new to the guild, so I'm still getting used to how it all works." The girl deflated slightly at Xander's apology. "Ah, sorry, it's just a bit of a touchy subject for me. I'm here to join the guild, even though my parents think I'm too young. But I'm not. I'm past the age to be considered a grown woman. My name is Gabrielle, by the way." "What's yours?" she asked, before crouching back down and going back to stroking Freya's cheek. Xander chuckled. "It's Xander. I remember being 19 too and desperate to get out from under my parents' thumb. Sometimes I miss those days now." "But that's the past," he said a little sadly, unsure what else to say. Gorell noticed the tone of Xander's voice trending down and changed the subject. "You said you're new, right? Have you gone on many contracts?" "Just the one, though it was quite the adventure," Xander answered. "I've only been in the guild for, I guess a little over a month now. But Frise here," he pointed his thumb behind him to where Frise had been listening to Xander speak to Gabrielle, "has been on plenty. Anything you want to know?" "Well," started Gabrielle, "what's it like, being out on the road, doing contracts, fighting monsters and beasts?" Well, it's not as exciting as it sounds a lot of the time," Frazzy began. There are long days of travel sometimes, and the going can get rough and tough. Fights can turn into a dangerous slog with one mistake, and you've got to keep your eyes and ears open at all times. Now, don't take that as me trying to turn you away from the trade. When the times are good, they are good. The adrenaline rush when you execute an ambush, the feeling of victory as you defeat a strong enemy. The friends, the people you meet, the places you see, I wouldn't trade it for any other career. Gabriel seemed thoughtful. I see. I'm glad you were willing to give it to me without glossing over the bad bits, too. I think it helps me think about it better, knowing that it's not like some kind of fairy tale story. What class are you, if you don't mind me asking? Xander was curious as to what niche Gabriel might fit. She wasn't wearing any equipment, and he found it hard to fit her into any of the archetypes he'd seen so far. We've got a fire mage and scholar of the ancient, a shield bearer and earth wielder. Frozay there is an archer, ranger and druid of the forest. As for myself, I'm an artificer, soldier, and demolitionist. Between us, I figure we can manage to offer some advice or answer questions about a class type. Well, my classes aren't very combat-oriented, said Gabriel, sounding downtrodden. My parents keep telling me that they aren't useful for the guild and that I should seek employment elsewhere, but I want to see the world outside of Anlet. I'm an herbalist and a medic. I was actually hoping to meet some other people my age here, since I'd need a group to achieve anything. But everyone is so busy and they all already seem like they have their own groups. I was just waiting in line to try and register before I saw Freyja here. I just had to pet her. I love cats. I think that's what I'm going to miss the most about home, besides my parents, of course, is the cat we have. Fraze gave Xander a long look that said, "Don't fuck this up." Xander gave a small cough, feeling a little uncomfortable about trying to recruit the girl. Well, we just happen to be starting the process of looking for contracts in town ourselves. We'd be happy to help you along and teach you the ropes. Frozay and Graphus and Atrax over there." Xander paused to point over to the two men, still obliviously going through posted contracts. "Have a lot of experience under their belt. They've done a great job mentoring me. I had no idea about any of this kind of thing before they taught me." Gabriel's eyes lit up. "Really? You'd really take me on, even though I can't fight like the other mercenaries? And you're okay with me being low level?" Frozay chimed in with, "What's important about a team is not always how they can fight. We like to have a wide variety of skills and options for us to be able to tackle any kind of situation. Just take Xander here. Sure, he can fight, but did you know he also does rune work? And don't worry about level. Xander also started out with less than 10 levels under his belt, and he's done quite well for himself so far. Besides, I'm sure one of the boys, especially Graphus, could teach you how to hold a sword if you really wanted. Though if you want to know a secret," Frozay leaned in conspiratorially and whispered, "bows are way better." Gabriel laughed at Frazay's joke, her previous nervousness forgotten, replaced by a giddy enthusiasm. "I think I'd like that. I always wanted to learn how to fight, but Father refused to get me any kind of weapon, let alone pay for lessons. Though I think the cost might have been part of the reason for not wanting lessons now that I think about it." Continued in comments. If you love engaging stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay updated with all the latest episodes from FY Stories.